Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oliver Curry. Dr. Curry is actually an alumni of LSE. He received his PhD in philosophy.
Government.
Government.
With a hint of this.
Government with a hint of philosophy in 2005. And he actually retains a research associate position here. His day job, however, is a senior researcher and director of the Oxford Morals Project at the Institute of Cognitive Evolutionary Anthropology at Oxford University. Oliver is one of those problem-focused researchers who brings whatever tools and methods are necessary to solve the problem that he's after, regardless of where those tools or methods come from, the particular discipline they come from. And he's done some great work trying to understand our moral values as values that are grounded in evolutionary challenges associated with cooperation. To tackle this problem, he draws on philosophy, psychology, and anthropology, and things that I've probably missed. For those of you who are familiar with the morality literature, I think his new paper, which I think he'll be discussing today, poses a real challenge to John Haidt's Moral Foundations model. Please join me in welcoming Oliver to the LSE faculty.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that kind introduction, and thanks very much to the psychology department for inviting me for this talk. As Michael said, my name is Oliver Scott Curry. I'm a recovering philosopher, presently doing psychology and anthropology in Oxford. And I'm interested in the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, ethical and unethical. I'm interested in where our morality comes from, what it is, what it's made of, how it works, and what it's for. Now, these are obviously ancient questions that scholars have been debating. Someone wants the answer. That scholars have been wrestling with for hundreds, thousands of years. And I think we're living at a very fortunate time, because I think now, thanks to some of the advances I'll be discussing, we now have a scientific answer to these questions of what morality is and how it comes, where it comes from and how it works. So I call this answer morality is cooperation. And essentially it's the argument that morality is a set of biological and cultural solutions to the problems of cooperation recurrent in human social life. And generally the argument is that humans face and have faced a range of different types of different problems of cooperation, different challenges, different opportunities for mutually beneficial interaction. And they've developed a range of solutions to these problems. They partly as a result of natural selection, of our biological heritage, the consequence of living with social primates. We've lived in social groups for 50 million years. So we have a range of innate solutions to these problems, but we're also an inventive species. We can invent new ways of doing things, new ways of living, new rules to live by. And so we have a range of cultural mechanisms, cultural devices that build on and elaborate on these cooperative dispositions. And these mechanisms they motivate our social, cooperative and altruistic behaviour, and they provide the criteria by which we judge the behaviour of others. And the argument is it's these solutions, in whatever form they take, whether they're instincts, intuitions, inventions, institutions, rules, norms, whatever, all of the above, it's these things that philosophers and others have called moral. It's these phenomena that moral philosophers and others have attached the label moral to. So we have, and these processes, as I'll go into more detail, explain these phenomena, explain the things that philosophers and others have struggled with for millennia. So, the general idea that morality has something to do with cooperation is not new. It's very ancient. You can find it in Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, all the way through to contemporary philosophy, and also in contemporary, more empirical approaches to morality. So here, for example, we have the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt arguing that moral systems are what make cooperative social life possible. We have the anthropologist Alan Fist arguing that morality functions to facilitate cooperative relationships with others. The primatologist and developmental psychologist Michael Tomasello saying that morality is a set of skills and motives for cooperating with others. And another recovering philosopher, the neuroscientist Joshua Green, arguing that the function of morality is to promote cooperation. So this is an old and ancient and widespread idea, and that aspect is not new. But what is new is that we can now use game theory, the theory of the mathematics of cooperation, the theory of non-zero-sum games, to state this hypothesis with more precision, to get down into the more precise formulation of this idea. So I'm not going to be testing you on all this. It's just to wash over you. But what I've got here is evolutionary game theory has identified a range of different types of cooperation. I'm going to be focusing on 7 here. And the general argument is that in each case we have good evolutionary and game theory to explain how these forms of cooperation can be established and get going. We have plenty of examples. In most cases, we have plenty of examples of these forms of cooperation being implemented and followed in lots of other species. We have lots of examples of humans behaving in the same ways, a mixture of innate and acquired traits. And in each case, it's exactly these cooperative traits that have been celebrated in moral philosophy as good things, as the components of morality. So to go through them briefly, just so you get the flavour. Kinship Kin Selection kin selection predicts that under certain conditions, organisms will be designed to detect and deliver benefits to their genetic relatives. We see this is a very widespread form of altruism in the natural world, especially evident, in the form of parental care. Humans too seem to have mechanisms for detecting and benefiting their kin, and obviously live in family groups all over the world. And you can find, I'm going to keep looking over this. You can find in lots of strands of philosophy a celebration of the duty of care that the parents have for their kids. Confucian ethics makes duties to the family the major value, the one that trumps all others, as well as avoiding mutual harm to kin in the form of avoiding incest. Mutualism refers to the benefits of working together, of forming teams to collaborate in pursuit of some common interest. There's some lovely game theory on this, often overlooked in David Lewis's book Convention and Thomas Schelling's book The Strategy of Conflict. We see, and Darwin has a lovely example where he talks about, he's discussing an observation of baboons who lift up rocks to get at the grubs underneath. And he records an observation where many baboons working together can pick up a larger rock than any can by themselves. And as a result, he says they then gather around and share the booty. So they have a smorgasbord of bugs to as a mutual benefit of working together. So this predicts that we should look to find adaptations that organisms have for solving coordination problems, working together, identifying others who have common interests, and meshing their behaviour together. There's lots of examples of this in nature just on a relatively simple level when it comes to herds and shoals and flocks of organisms getting together for mutual defence from predators. Some evidence of mutualism, teamwork amongst the predators as well, collaborative hunting. And certainly in terms of humans, we're extremely groupish. It's almost impossible to stop humans forming groups, identifying in-groups and out-groups, and benefiting the in-group often at the expense of out-groups. And again, you see some of these. Thanks to mechanisms like theory of mind, humans can also generate and share expectations about behaviour to solve coordination problems, which are called social constructions or conventions or norms, which again facilitate coordination. And again, you can find all of these traits being celebrated by moral philosophers, whether that's friendship or loyalty to your group, or conformity, or the adoption of norms in general. Incidentally, if you go through the literature like this, you can, for any given box, you can find some philosopher or some school of thought saying their thing is the only thing and the best thing, and ignoring everything else. So this Josiah Royce, by the way, has a lovely book called The Philosophy of Loyalty.
It's a smart board.
Not that smart. He has a lovely book called The Philosophy of Loyalty, and like everyone else, he says loyalty is the crown of the virtues. Because it creates the conditions, i.e., working together for a common cause. It creates the conditions, the necessary conditions in which all the other virtues are displayed. So it's only in the context of collaborative effort that you can reciprocate and be heroic and do everything else. But you can find examples of that everywhere. Everyone thinks their thing is the thing, but I try to put all the things together. So social exchange refers to the well-known the problem represented by the prisoner's dilemma and the free rider problem. So here, the idea is that cooperation can be jeopardised by free riders who take the benefit of cooperation without paying the cost. And in order for cooperation to be stable, you need to detect and reject those individuals. And that could be done in a variety of ways, but through a strategy of conditional cooperation, where you, in a repeated interaction, you cooperate only as long as the other person or other persons are reciprocating or returning the favour. As made famous in Axelrod's tournaments, in which the strategy for tit for tat fared very well against all the others. Given that it's a relatively simple strategy, there's surprisingly few examples. Do I just touch it? It just moves.
Depends where you touch it.
I won't touch it then. Given that it's a slightly rather simple strategy, there seems surprisingly few examples of it in nature. I think I'm right in saying that there's no well-established examples of full-blown reciprocal altruism in any other species. There's lots of sort of sub-components of it have been observed in different species, but not quite all together. But who knows? Maybe we haven't found it yet. But there's little doubt that humans are veteran reciprocators. They seem to have adaptations for detecting cheats, for moralistic anger and revenge against cheats. Reciprocity emerges early in development as a strategy. Seems to be found all over the world. And again, reciprocity and its various subcomponents are celebrated in lots of different moral philosophies. There's a whole school of thought based on social contracts. Again, thinking that contracts are the be-all and end-all of morality, and you can find similar celebrations of trust, gratitude, guilt, making amends for cheating, apologising, and forgiveness, all subcomponents of this strategy. So those three are fairly familiar. Less familiar are the various solutions to hawk-dove games, or ways of resolving conflict that minimise the costs for the protagonists. Even though that was this conflicts and resolving conflicts was the first type of social interaction to be analysed with game theory by Maynard Smith in the 70s. So the basic idea here is that organisms often come into conflict over resources, over food, territory, and mates. And let's suppose Michael and I are in conflict over this glass of water. There's a number of things we could do. We could just have a straight-out punch-up, in which case whoever was the strongest would probably win. So let's say, hypothetically, Michael would win. Hypothetically. But we both lose out there, in terms of the costs of fighting, the risks of injury, the wasted energy. So one way of avoiding those mutual costs is, instead of having a fight, to have a contest. And so we could just agree to stand and flex our muscles at one another and let whoever has the biggest muscles win. So in that case, Michael would still win. So the outcome would be the same, but we both benefit. There'd be a mutual benefit in terms of avoiding the costs of conflict. So the game theory predicts we should look for. We expect to find a display-defer strategy to be widespread used in these contexts, and indeed animal contests, ritual contests in which antagonists display their traits that are reliable indicators of their fighting ability are very widespread, much more, practically ubiquitous compared to reciprocity. Depending on the species, you can find different traits will carry the day. So sometimes it's who can bellow the loudest, sometimes it's who's got the biggest antlers, sometimes it's who weighs the most, who's the smelliest, who's the oldest. Be a whole range of different traits. My favourite example is sometimes when spiders are competing over a particular site or a particular web, they'll stand next to each other, kind of like on the trampoline, and try and bounce one another off the trampoline, and whoever's the biggest bounces the best, and then the little one backs off. So we expect to see we expect to see two sets of traits. We expect to see costly signals of fighting ability, of power, of strength, of ability to absorb cost, and on the other side of the coin, we expect to see a suite of submissive traits of deference, of conceding resource, of backing down, of knowing when you're beaten. And we see exactly those, and humans certainly seem to exhibit those traits, and like other social animals, they form dominance hierarchies downstream of those contexts. And dominance hierarchies where individuals already know they can already anticipate the outcome of a contest, so they don't need to go through the whole rigmarole all over again, represent a further de-escalation of conflict, a more frictionless way of allocating resources by rank. And these are two ends of the same conditional strategy, so the theories together here. But we see these two different sets of traits celebrated by moral philosophers and others. So you can find Aristotle and Machiavelli and Mill and most recently Alistair McIntyre celebrating the virtues, the heroic virtues of fortitude, bravery, skill, generosity, and intelligence. And Hume called them the heroic virtues, and he contrasted them with the monkish virtues of humility, deference, respect, obedience, submission, self-denial, abnegation, acquiescence, or quietude, or that sort of thing. If the glass of water is divisible, it doesn't need to be an all or nothing contest. If a resource is divisible, then another stable strategy is to divide it according to the relative fighting ability of the protagonists or antagonists. And if the contestants are equally powerful, then that results in equal shares or fair shares. There's some examples of this in other species, especially in experimental games with other primates, work by Sarah Brosnan and others. She might be a co-author on that one. And certainly we see fair shares, dividing things equally, seems to be a widespread. Certainly humans have a sense of fairness, and they seem to use that as the default rule in lots of kind of decision situations, especially experimental games all over the world. And again, obviously fairness or negotiation and compromise or impartiality, again, is a trait celebrated by lots of moral philosophers and others. And finally, the dispute over resources can be resolved by deferring to prior possession, so whoever got it first. This is an evolution stable strategy. You find it in lots of other species who recognise and defer to prior ownership or occupation of a territory. Humans seem to have the same psychology. It emerges very early in child development. Infants and toddlers can recognise when things are owned or not. And you find it cemented into international relations and into property law. First possession is one of the, well, property is 9/10 of the law, as it were. And similarly, you find property rights, the right one has to the fruits of your labour to be widely celebrated in moral philosophy, and as well as the prohibitions against the converse, the prohibitions against that. So the point is that if you start with first principles from using the theory of non-zero-sum games to fractionate out these different types of cooperation, you end up with something like a periodic table of ethics that tells you, gives you a comprehensive view of morality and tells you what kinds of things to look for in the world, what kinds of things to expect, and gives you a suite of explanations of them. And these are the most prominent and well-studied types of games. There may well be there are indeed other types of non-zero-sum games that we could in the future use to extend this table. And so that's a kind of cut out and keep guide to the same material. So again, there's different types of cooperation. We see it in humans and animals. The traits that emerge as a result are exactly the kind of things that moral philosophers have focused on. And if you follow this logic through, you end up with a moral taxonomy that supersedes some previous attempts to map the moral domain, which have not used the maths of cooperation, that have not used game theory. So here's morality's cooperation. Here are the 7 types of cooperation I've been talking about. And one prominent previous attempt to map the moral domain is Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations. He's argued that there's 5 foundations on which humans rely to make moral decisions: loyalty, authority, fairness, care, and purity. And he, like I said at the beginning, he too argues that morality has evolved to promote cooperation. But the categories that he's proposing were the result of a very small review of the literature, and which he subsequently said are fairly ad hoc, so they're not derived from any underlying theory. And perhaps that explains why an approach that purports to be evolutionary doesn't have a domain dedicated to kin altruism, doesn't have a domain dedicated to reciprocity, doesn't have a domain dedicated to costly signals of prowess, like things like bravery, and doesn't have a domain dedicated to property rights. So for an evolutionary theory of morality to miss out these major chunks, I suggest is a major fault. It also has a couple of other categories, which I think definitely have something to do with morality, but care is fairly general purpose. It's a bit like altruism. The point is, it's there, but there are different types of care, just like there's different types of altruism. And purity is a whole grab bag of different things, some of which have yet to be fully explained or investigated. Jonathan Haidt refers to that as an odd corner of morality. It doesn't quite fit in. And one of the projects I'd like to do next is try and unpack that and see to what extent the various components of it can be explained as solutions to different types of cooperation. Anyway, so that's the difference, and a questionnaire based on the moralities cooperation principles outperforms a questionnaire based on moral foundations theory, but that's another project which I'll talk about next time you invite me. So I said, but onto the meat of today's talk. So I said that moralities cooperation is a scientific answer, it's a scientific theory of morality, and what I mean by that is at least two things. One is that it makes use of nothing more than well-established findings in the natural sciences and the life sciences. And secondly, it makes predictions about the world, makes predictions about what we'd expect morality to look like that we can put to the test. Perhaps the most basic prediction is that if it's the case that these traits are the constituent components of morality, it should be the case that people regard these behaviours, these traits, as morally good. They should think that it's morally good to help your family, to help your group, to return favours, to be brave, as an example of a hawkish trait, to defer to authority, to divide disputed resources, and to respect or recognise property. And to the extent that moralities cooperation purports to be a general theory of morality, we can take it further. We could say, if this theory is true, then it should be the case that people all over the world, irrespective of culture, will find these traits, or regard these traits as morally good. And conversely, the theory predicts that there'll be no cultures anywhere in which any of these 7 traits are considered morally bad. So this prediction is obviously a challenge to moral relativism, which we can operationalize as the hypothesis that morality varies substantially and radically, and specifically it might predict that there should be at least one counterexample to one of these predictions somewhere in the world. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried, but it's quite hard to pin down a moral relativist. But here's, just to flesh out the point, here's just a couple of examples. You have to go quite far back to find it stated in this way, but here's John Locke, who thought that morality was all learnt and therefore likely to vary substantially, arguing in the late 1600s something, something like that. John Locke arguing that there's scarce a principle of morality to be named which is not somewhere or other slighted and condemned by whole societies of men who are governed by rules of living quite opposite to others. So for any given, he argued that for any given virtue, you should be, that trait will somewhere else in some other culture be considered a vice. And making a similar point, the American Anthropological Association, responding to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, argued that the ideas of right and wrong, good and evil, differ in their expression among different peoples. What's held to be a right in one society may be regarded as antisocial by another people. So again, we can derive from this a prediction that there should be at least one culture somewhere in which one of these types of cooperation is considered morally bad. There should be one counterexample, some opposite example to the thesis. So those are the two competing predictions about what we should find in the world. Well, what do we find in the world? Again, I'm not going to be testing you on this, but just let it wash over you. So there's been plenty of cross-cultural work on morality. Here's just a summary of the references, what their measure has been, what their question is, what their what their method was, whether it was experiments or questionnaires or what have you, what their sample was, how many societies and what types of people, and what they found. I'm obviously not going to go through all these in detail, but the essential point is that none of this previous work tests this particular prediction. None of this work has been informed by this full range of evolutionary theories, and so as it stands, we don't know if it's the case or how prevalent these views are. So to summarise, some of that work has shown that some types of cooperation are moral in some places, but none of them have shown that all of the types of cooperation are moral in all of the places. And more problematic, those different experiments have used different measures in different places, meaning that the results are impossible to combine, and we can't extract any overall picture as a result. And even studies that you might expect to have done that, like the World Value Survey, which is a repeated measure of values from 90 countries around the world, even that hasn't really tapped into these questions. It asks about a whole range of different things, a whole range of different values, not very much about morality per se. And when it does ask about those, it uses the Schwartz Value Questionnaire, which has some very generic categories like benevolence as one type of morality. And even then, it doesn't ask about the valence of types of behaviour. It asks whether the person to report whether they are benevolent or not, which is a different question. So in the absence of any definitive empirical data, opinions have been free to vary, and you can find people all across the spectrum. So you can find Donald Brown, for example, arguing in an otherwise lovely book, Human Universals, that traits like empathy, reciprocity, honesty, generosity, hospitality are cultural universals, but on the basis of no data. There's no data or evidence in that book, and there's no data or evidence that he could refer to because it doesn't exist. On the other hand, you can find philosophers like Jesse Prince arguing the opposite. He's argued that there are no moral universals, or if they exist, no one's found them, or they're very hard to find. Again, on the basis of no evidence, on a couple of cherry-picked examples. So at the moment, we just don't know. Until now. So, in order to find out, in order to test these predictions, we conducted our own survey, our own study. And in order to do so, we turned to the Human Relations Area Files. So the Human Relations Area Files is the gold standard for ethnography. It's an archive housed at Yale, located in Yale, where for the last 60 years they have collated all of the anthropology books, all of the ethnographies, all of the monographs on thousands of monographs on hundreds of different cultures around the world, all of the that meet a particular quality threshold. So in order to enter into the archive, the anthropologists had to have been in the culture for over a year and speak the language and meet various other conditions. And when all of these bodies of work enter the archive, some poor postdoc goes through them, or has gone through them all, and coded all of these books by topic at the paragraph level. So he or she might go through them and say, okay, this paragraph is about, just imagine imagine them in some basement somewhere weeping. So they've gone through all these works and said, okay, this paragraph, this one's about marriage and dress codes. Okay, this next paragraph is about marriage and feasting practices. This next, and so on. And there's several hundred labels, agreed upon labels that they use to flag what the topic is. They don't code the content of the paragraph, just what the topic is. And from our point of view, it turns out to be very useful because some of the topic labels, some of the flags include the label ethics and norms. So we were able to go into this archive and extract all of the paragraphs that have been labelled ethics and the ones that have been labelled norms. And we used a few other keyword searches to scrape up any other relevant paragraphs that might have been missed. And we did that not for the full range of societies in HRAP in the archive, but for what's called the probability sample files, 60 societies that since the late 60s were sort of earmarked as being the most well documented, the most well attested cultures that are a random sample of cultures around the world from the 6 different cultural regions of the world, as represented by the dots here. So when we extracted this material from HRAF, we were left with it delivered to us over 3,000 paragraphs describing ethics in these 60 cultures. This was over 500,000 words of text from over 600 unique sources, spanning a period of 300 years. I think the median publication date was something like 1941. So most of it is sort of early 20th century, but it spans the whole, the entire corpus of anthropology. And my co-author and I went through all of these paragraphs and coded them according to whether they provided any evidence that the cooperative behaviour of interest had a positive or a negative moral valence. And we had a third hypothesis-blind coder go over our results, and there's a procedure for conferring afterwards and resolving disputes, not involving flexing muscles, to come to sort of convergent codings on the different paragraphs. So let me just say a bit more about how that's done. So this, for example, this is a version of the instructions we gave to the third coder. So what we said was, what we're looking for each paragraph, tell us whether, if it has a description, if it mentions a particular behaviour, like helping a family member, or working in a team, or deferring to someone more powerful. If you see that, is it given a moral valence? If it's given a positive moral valence, if that behaviour is referred to as good or right or mothical, ethical, moral, or mothical, or an obligation or a duty or whatever, then to give it a plus. And if it's referred to as bad or wrong or immoral or unmothical, then give it a minus. And just as an example, here's one example of the kind of, here's a sort of typical paragraph. In this case, from Korea, in a book talking about Confucian morality, or in a section talking about Confucian morality, and the author says that the cardinal concepts of Confucian morality include parental grace and filial piety. So parental grace is sort of parental generosity to the offspring, to your kids. It includes paying back the debt incurred by a favour, and it includes ordination or subordination between older and younger. So the subordination of the young to the old. So in that case, we would have said, okay, this provides some indication that an example of kin, altruism, reciprocity, and deference or respect is considered morally good in this paragraph. Okay. So what did we find? Well, going through those 3,000 plus paragraphs, we made 962 observations of a moral valence of one or other of these 7. To keep all this in mind, 962 observations of the moral valence of one or other of these 7 cooperative behaviours. And what did we find? Well, remember, we are predicting that they would be mostly or uniformly positive. These cooperative behaviours would be considered morally good. Whereas the alternative prediction, let's call it the moral relativist prediction, would say there would be a significant or substantial or perhaps an equal number of societies in which they were considered morally bad. There should be a decent number of opposite examples too. So what did we find? We found that, rather embarrassingly, the results were uniformly positive. That in every case where there was a moral valence attached to one of these 7 behaviours, they were always positive. And there were no negative examples at all, except for one counterexample, which kind of, in a way, is the exception that proves the rule down here. So this was a case among the Chuk people in Micronesia, where the paragraph described, it was said, open theft is considered admirable because it shows the bravery of the thief. So even this was a case where sort of one virtue was being trumped by another. And in that culture, there were, in the Chuk paragraphs, there are also a whole load of other paragraphs also attesting to the usual defence of property and the prohibition of theft. So it was one example amongst a bunch of others, which are in there. So so that's one question answered. The study also allowed us to
Can I
look
ask
at.
a question?
Yes.
What's the status of this exceptional case in your model? Did you give consideration? Did you?
Yeah. Well, it's one data point amongst 900.
And that would be dismissed because it's just one, or would
No,
be something to interfere with the model?
Well, it's one data point amongst 900, so I'm giving it its due. It's
Recognized.
yeah, and noted, and also we'll come back to this at the end. Also, it raises a question for future exploration in terms of how morals conflict and how that's reconciled. But I'll come to that. So another thing that this survey has allowed us to answer is, well, how common are these? I'm going to call them cooperative morals. How common are these cooperative morals? I mean, it could be the case that, okay, every time you see them, they're mentioned in a positive light, but it could be that they don't crop up that often, or they only crop up in a few societies that are relatively rare, which would indicate that although there might be something going for the theory, there's a lot more to morality than cooperation. There's a whole bunch of other things that we've yet to encounter. Or it gives you a measure of how much more there is to explain, which there obviously is. So are they rare, or are they common, these things? In how many societies do we find them? Do we make these observations? Again, just let this wash over you. So here are the 60 societies along the top, organised by region, and here are the behaviours of interest. And the dots just indicate a hit, a positive, that there's one or more paragraphs on this society in which this behaviour is referred to in a positive light, is given a positive moral valence. So as you can see, there are lots of dots, and most of these behaviours are considered morally good in most societies, with one exception. Here's the same data, just aggregated by percentage of the societies. And as you can see, we found examples of most of these behaviours being considered good in most places, with the exception of fairness, which I'll come back to at the end. Another question is that's their frequency. They seem to be fairly common, they're not unusual moral rules by any means. Another question is how are they distributed? Are these societies just in the West, or just in the East, or are there significant differences between one region and another? Or are these morals distributed evenly around the world? We could look at that too, and to cut a long story short, an ANOVA of frequency of positive moral valence by region, and for each of these 7 types of behaviour shows there's no significant difference in the frequency of these observations by region. So this indicates that they're observed with equal frequency all around the world in all different regions. The regions roughly correspond to the continents. Okay,
Did you have the West in your model as well?
I had the whole world.
Well, yeah.
But small
I was looking.
That's
No, at the end in the ANOVA that you analysis of variance. I was trying to look at the table.
yeah. So
Africa?
so we use the category that HRAP uses. So we use their sampling frame. So and they organise us as 60 societies into these regions, and some of them are a bit wonky, like circum-Mediterranean is North Africa and Europe. So I think it goes all the way up to the Scotland. But we
includes North Europe as well.
Yes,
Okay.
the Sami, I think, and
That's
yeah.
what I want.
So that's the study. So in summary, we predicted that these cooperative behaviours would be considered morally good and would be so everywhere. This seems to be the case with the moral valence of these behaviours is universally positive. Even the exceptions seem to prove the rule, or at least are consistent with the development of the theory. There's no culture overall in which any of these cooperative behaviours has a negative moral valence. From this data, these cooperative morals are common, they're present in most cultures, and they're observed with equal frequency across all regions all around the world. So these findings give strong support for the theory of morality as cooperation, from which this prediction derives, and no support whatsoever for moral relativism, the theory that there'll be at least one culture in which there's an opposite, there's a strong counterexample. There's a few more. Oh, and here are some examples of some of the things we found. And to me, the most surprising thing was that there was nothing surprising in all of this material. So when I went into this project, I certainly expected to find lots of examples of reciprocity and kinship and working in groups and that kind of thing. But I also thought there was going to be a whole load of weird stuff. There's going to be a whole load of, in such and such a society, it was moral to stand on one leg on a Tuesday, or in such and such a society, it was moral to cut your hand off, or if there was a full moon. Or so. Well, I thought there was going to be lots of strange things that would be, if not defeat the theory, at least be a major challenge to it and be a big problem of something. Well, how are we going to go about explaining this? Can we revise, or do we have to abandon the approach? But to my surprise, there was nothing that was completely bizarre, or that would strike anyone in this room as particularly bizarre or weird or unusual. Certainly some differences in priority that would strike you as unusual, but nothing that was incomprehensible or totally strange. But let me just end by just making a few more comments about the material. So one question you might have is, well, if these problems of cooperation, these different problems of social life are universal, why didn't we find the morals universal? Why were they present in every society we looked at? And I think there's and in particular, why, for example, some categories like fairness are very underrepresented, or there's very few examples. I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that we're relying on serendipitous data, so it's not like these anthropologists were charged with going out and answering these questions, testing these theories themselves. We're very much reliant on all this material was gathered long before these theories were developed and long before I came on the scene. So we're very much reliant on one or other anthropologist having to have been interested in that topic, or happening to have made that observation and recorded it. In some cases, you hit pay dirt. Someone's gone out and written an ethnography of the ethics of such and such a society. In other cases, it was on a completely different topic, and you'd be lucky to get a passing mention of some aspect of morality. So the data was very serendipitous, and for that reason, I think our findings are an underestimate, or the lower end of the range of how frequent these types of morality are. Another aspect, specifically to do with fairness, I think has to do with why there are a few examples of fairness, has to do with an artifact of the method. So when we were looking at kin altruism, there are many behaviours that fit that category. So helping your brother, helping your children, helping a distant relative. There are lots of examples of that, lots of observations as a result that could then be coded. When it came to fairness, we were looking for something very, very specific. We were looking for behaviours that divided a dispute in order to forestall a conflict. So, for example, there are quite a few cases of fairness being applied in inheritance rules, where it was made explicit that inheritance was divided equally amongst the offspring in order to avoid conflict among them. So there were loads of examples of sharing being considered a good thing, and even things being displayed as fair, but they're often used in very general terms. So people would share things with their family, or it's used very generically. And we were looking for something very much more precise. And as a result, because of the sort of narrow window of things we were looking for, there were fewer observations. It happened less often than all the different examples of kin altruism, and was observed and recorded less often. So I wouldn't read too much into the low score for fairness. Another point to make about the results is that it's not an implication of this study that morality is identical around the world. Far from it. The theory doesn't predict it, and that's not what we found. So the theory predicts that morality is an attempt to solve, it's a set of solutions to solve various problems. So we'd expect that as the problems vary in frequency or import, the theory predicts so would the corresponding solutions, so would the importance of the corresponding values. So if you live in a society sort of embedded in a large network of extended kin, you might expect family values and due to your obligations to your kin to loom very large, to be an important aspect of your morality. Whereas if you live in a modern, atomised, mobile society where you're in smaller family groups who are living alone, then we wouldn't expect it to be, we might expect people to understand the concept, but we wouldn't expect this to be a particularly important value. So, and I think we couldn't code for this in the material, but that was certainly the impression that we got from the material, that although everyone has the same values, they have different priorities and they're prioritised in different ways, or the society is prioritising in different ways. So it's like everyone has the same knobs, but they're twiddled in different ways. And and they come into conflict, and a lot of the variation has to do with how those conflicts, which ones take priority. So in some places, it seemed to be the case that loyalty, commitment to your family trumped everything else. It was more important than loyalty to your group, for example. But in other places, the priorities were slightly different, and loyalty to your group took precedence over loyalty to your family, or loyalty was more important to. It was more important to pay tribute to the chief than it was to return the favour, for example. And even so, even with these 7 types of morality, and I think there's more too, even variation in the priorities attached to these 7 types generates a huge amount of variation, a huge amount of possible combinations of orderings of these values that I think is more than enough to accommodate the variation that we see in the material.
How well do you think you can predict that cultural variation?
Well, Michael, that's a good question. It's almost as if I've planted you there, because that's one of the things we want to find out next. So I think there's a range of straightforward predictions we can, the first things you want to look at are things like does family size or group size or degree of warfare or degree of trade predict the importance of these moral values?
Right.
I was hoping we'd be able to test that in this ethnographic material, the archive material, but it's not rich enough to do it, and like I said, it's too serendipitous. So one of the projects we have next is using a questionnaire based on this framework to go and gather new data from 50 cultures around the world now, contemporary cultures, which will give us an opportunity to test exactly that, to look at what are the test predictions about the local, social, ecological conditions we might expect to foster change priorities, both within cultures and between cultures.
It's a big project.
It is a big project. So that's part of the next step. So in terms of what we want to do next, we plan to go through HRAF to mop up some of the other things that we found in the course of this study. There's more than the 7 that I mentioned, and it'll be good to get a handle on them. Another project is to extend the theory to see to what extent can other yet to be understood aspects of morality yield to the same theory. So, for example, one area that we haven't looked at, we avoided sex altogether for the course of this project because it's very complicated and we don't have good theories of it yet. But it's a question whether sexual morality, things like prohibitions against masturbation or fidelity, or in favour of fidelity, against infidelity, incest and all the rest. To what extent is this a category unto itself, a completely different set of considerations, or to what extent are the various components of sexual morality, are they attempts to solve problems of cooperation within and between the sexes? So to what extent is infidelity is cheating? To what extent is that violating the social contract of marriage, for example? So it's something that it's one of the ways we want to extend the theory to see whether and to what extent it explains some of those interactions too. And like I said, we also have, equipped with this new questionnaire, we also have plans to gather data gather new data that allow us to look at cross-cultural variation and look at things like the heritability of these different domains. And the hope is that by continuing to treat, by demystifying morality, by continuing to treat it as just an ordinary object of scientific inquiry, just another branch of psychology and the behavioural sciences, that will be able to accelerate our understanding of this essential element of human nature. Thank you very much.
Take your own questions?
Yeah, sure. Any questions?
Thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
I'm going to go straight for a big one, I'm afraid. This archive, this database, you speak of it almost as though you see it as being the revealed reality of these different cultures. It's actually a construction of ethnographers who have tended to come from certain countries and cultures and to set forth with a set of expectations. Did you question and interrogate the data at all? Did you look for changes over time? Contradictions between ethnographers?
So, I mean, for the purpose of this study, we just did exactly what I said before. So, just if this behaviour occurs, is it referred to as good or bad? But yeah, so there is a question of how reliable is the data.
So did white men go looking for that behaviour and did they find it?
Well, they didn't go looking for it. Just did they have? Let me ask the question. So we're relying on this standard archive, and there are questions about the reliability of the data. It's not as if everyone went out with brain scans and scanned, the brains of hundreds of locals over all this time. However, I'm not particularly concerned about it for a variety of reasons. So one is that it's not the case that they're all Western anthropologists. So half of the contributors to this archive, at least post-war, are local to the societies that they were documenting. It's also the case that they, as I said, they collected these ethnographies prior to these theories being developed. Like most of them were in the early 20th century. So before any of these specific types of evolution explanations, game theoretic explanations of morality were devised. And if anything, if I was worried about bias going into it, I was actually worried in the opposite direction. So anthropologists have a reputation for exaggerating the exotic and going out and finding the most unusual cases. So that's why I was worried. I was kind of concerned going into it, thinking I'm going to find lots of, traveller's tales, lots of extraordinary, unbelievable things. But as I said, even given, so if anything, they're going to be biased against the hypothesis. Because no, you can't make a name for yourself in anthropology by coming back and saying, yeah, they're the same as us. So my concern was that they'd be biased against the hypothesis, and they don't seem to be according to this material, but even given that bias, they still didn't provide examples that busted the theory. But at the end of the day, again, I agree with you, it's not perfect data, but it's the only data that we have on these societies. And it also occurs to me that it's a bit of it would be a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for social anthropologists or ethnographers to say, well, the way the debate goes is the evolutionists will say, well, we predict that these morals are going to be everywhere. But the ethnographers in the past have said, oh no, well, there's this culture and that culture does something differently. So we've said, okay, I'll see your ethnography and I'll raise you one comparative study. So we've gone on to their turf, as it were, and looked at their material, at the this gold standard of ethnography, and this is what we found from their own material. So if the as it were, the moral relativists respond by saying, oh, well, it's all rubbish anyway, and you can't rely on it, that would be a bit of a weak position to be in. Let's keep going and maybe we'll come back. Any other questions here?
Just a quick question about how when you had contradictory data points, so with your theft and bravery, did you double code it?
So for example, with the Chuk, there were, I forget exactly, but let's say there were 15 observations of the moral valence of property, and one of those 15 was negative, so we coded that as negative. There were other paragraphs that gave the usual prohibitions against theft.
Okay, so it was the paragraph itself was completely in favor of theft and therefore.
The 962 is not paragraphs, it's observations. So a paragraph could have more than one observation in it, like the Korean one I mentioned. I don't remember whether that particular paragraph had contradictory things.
Okay.
Mike.
Why don't you go first?
So if we continue with these values, 7 values, if you looked for the opposite of that, so for example you had something like groups, you look for individual, and look for paragraphs based on that. Would it be possible that the opposite still is morally favorable, so that you find the same positive moral results for an opposite value?
I'm not quite sure what you mean. What do you have in mind?
What I have in mind is that you looked for group or things based on group, or there was one value, right?
Yeah. So one of them was, say, teamwork. It was
teamwork,
yeah.
So teamwork, that you went out there and formed paragraphs, and then they were perceived as morally favorable.
Yes.
This is what you found. So my question would be if you would not look for group, but for the opposite would be individualistic, not teamwork, but individualistic work. If you look for this, would it be possible that you still find findings that say, okay, this individualistic value is still morally favorable, although it's the opposite?
So that's possible. So the codings also include the opposite. So for example, if it said bravery is good, is morally good, that got a tick. If it said cowardice is morally bad, that also got a tick, because it's just the same way, different way of saying the same thing, that it's bad to be cowardice, to be a coward, it's good to be brave. So I can't remember now how often it was, but if it said teamwork is good, if it had said going off and doing your own thing and not contributing to the collective effort is bad, that would have been considered a tick as well, because it's saying the opposite of doing this is bad. I think the vast majority of examples were talking about the upside of teamwork rather than the bad side of going it alone. But if it was put that precisely, then it would have been picked up by the survey. There were also like I said, there's a separate set of traits that I think if we went back and went through it again, looking for a range of other things, one of the other traits included things like telling the truth, being generous with your surplus, with what you have, and working hard, being industrious as opposed to being lazy. So if that's what you are thinking of, I think that would crop up quite frequently too.
It's funny I'm asking this question because usually I'm saying the opposite, but there might be a problem given that your data set is entirely small scale and doesn't include some, I suppose, weird societies or subsets of that. I'm just wondering whether there have been kind of moral innovations that have allowed us to kind of ramp up to large-scale societies. So I'm thinking of, the Christian invocation to love your enemies, or be good to those who hate you, pushes towards individualism and not conforming to the group, and maybe even as recently as World War II, not conforming to authority or going against authority. These seem like innovations that might actually be necessary for large-scale cooperation.
Yes, so that is a true thing. First of all, not all of the societies are hunter-gatherers or sort of subsistence level. There are some more modern societies. So the Korean examples were some of them are post-war societies, for example.
Right.
Some of them aren't quite large, but yes, the majority of them are traditional societies. And yes, there are some. I can't. This isn't something that we coded, but there do seem to be. My impression was there did seem to be some large differences in some of the values in aggregate. So in the traditional societies, it seemed to be the case that there was a very high priority placed on obligations to kin, group loyalty, and deference, and relatively few examples of reciprocity and fairness. Whereas modern Western weird societies would tend to think of it the other way around. That there's fewer in Western societies. There's fewer rules regarding the regulation of standing social relationships of established state relationships, and more rules regarding the interactions of anonymous strangers, like reciprocity and fairness. So there does seem to be that big shift, and that's a shift that's been recognised in anthropology in general, from the shift from status to contract. In terms of whether there's innovations that have made that possible, yes, I think there has been. Often it's a matter of leveraging one type of cooperation against the other. So it's almost, in order to promote trade, we have to downgrade authority or deference or hierarchy, or as in, you know, it's not we have to, it's that as the rewards for trade, as the payoff to trade gets larger, the importance attached to feudal hierarchy went down. So I think those kinds of things, one was traded off against another. I think there's also a range of cultural innovations which I've yet to have a sort of good compendium of, but I think there's certainly new ways of doing things. I always think of queuing as an example. So queuing is one way of resolving a dispute over resources on a kind of first come, first served basis. I don't think it's a universal, but it's a novel invention that we all take part in every day. It has the similar logic, but is a novel institution. And yeah, I expect there to be. So this gives a framework for being able to look for those.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it says that your theory is wrong. It's just that it's incomplete and that there might be more as we expand into the modern world.
Well, it's only incomplete in what way? So it's open to there being novel inventions for achieving these ends.
Yeah.
So if we find some more, then it would be consistent with the thing.
Right.
Yes.
If I can, thank you. I think this is a very interesting project, and I like the idea of being able to go into a database and try to identify these issues. My question is, okay, I can, you know, from what I understood, you're trying to propose a set of values or say characteristics of moral behavior that could be linked back to our biology and to our evolved, you know, phylogenetic history, right? Which I think is something that needs to be done. However, you know, I think it complicates tremendously when we start to look at the development of moral categories, both in the ontogenesis, in the development of the child, and historically across different societies and different timelines. I'm thinking, for instance, how can we make sense of fratricide or parasite or infanticide, which is a human behavior that presents in all epochs, as far as we know, it continues to present today, and it's morally justifiable for many, many societies. So I'm wondering if the problem of violence is a problem that will complicate your theory, if you attribute positives and negatives to behaviors that sometimes make perfect sense for and are adaptive. Actually, I'm thinking about, for instance, death without whipping by that anthropologist who studied women who just need to cope with the death of their infants because they, what's her name? Nancy. Yes,
Yeah.
you know who I'm.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
That.
Nancy Shepherd Hughes.
Yes, exactly. So I wonder how you would correct that, because I think I can see the value of building a universal theory of morality. I sympathize with the impetus of that, but I find very complicated when you're dealing with the concretization and the realization of human behavior to attribute valence to what humans actually do when they are faced with tremendously difficult and complex ecological, you know.
I agree. So let me just say three quick things. So one is a plug for HRAF. So HRAF is available online now, it's all digital. So whatever it is you're interested in, go and have a look at it. If you want to spend 3 years doing a comparative ethnography, knock yourself out. Alternatively, you just want to find some good, interesting cross-cultural illustrations of the topic that you're interested in, it's good for that too. So have a look. Secondly, in terms of attributing valence, it wasn't us that's attributing valence. We're predicting a valence, but it's the anthropologists reporting what their informants, the valence reported by their informants. So we are just documenting what it said in the text. How not what the anthropologist's stated view was, but what they reported the members of these societies said. So we're just coding the existing material. But in terms of, I completely agree with you. There are other there's a whole range of additional types of morality, a whole range of other moral phenomena that it is as yet unclear if or whether they would fit into this scheme. So there's lots of puzzles and there's lots of things that we don't know, and I don't have a definitive answer to all the different sides that you mentioned. But I'm cautiously optimistic that many of them will yield to the same analysis. So Nancy Sheffer-Hughes' lifeboat ethics paper is about killing children, but the title lifeboat ethics, the justification is you have to sacrifice one in order to save the others. So in that case, she's doing something. Not she's not doing it. She's reporting. She's reporting people making a horrible sacrifice for the greater good of their family, and in a sense, it's justified for exactly that reason. So I suspect that if we go into these tough cases, these things that on the surface look deeply unpleasant and shocking, I would predict that in many cases they will yield to the same analysis, that what's happening is one type of cooperation is being pursued at the expense of another, or is being used to justify why one thing is relatively more important than another.
But the emergence of the state has also been a very bloody affair, where families have killed each other.
Yeah. Well, see, that's another thing is
for
it's
millennia. So
Yes.
I think an interesting case would be the emergency of the state,
Yeah,
as a case that will also complicate your.
it would. So these are all interesting things to get to grips with. And again, just to be clear, the prediction isn't that everyone's going to be moral all the time. The general prediction is people have a range of different dispositions, but they have some competitive, predatory dispositions, as well as some cooperative, moral ones. And here the focus is on the moral ones. But obviously they can come into conflict, and sometimes people do bad things. Any other questions?
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you so much.
All right,
Well,
thank you.
really wonderful. Lunch is already there, so we can just head over there and chat more.